All right. So we still have people arriving, but I'm going to get going here because we have a jam-packed webinar today. I'm pretty excited about the topic. And thanks for joining, everyone. My name is Brian Edwards. I'm going to be your host today. I'm the Director of Products and Services here at Habanero, or at Habanero, not here. We're at a webinar. I thought I'd start with a few webinar notes for everyone. We are going to be recording this webinar today, so if you'd like to rewatch it or share it afterwards, you'll be able to do that. We'll follow up with everyone with a webinar link so you can view it afterwards. We'd also love to keep today fresh and lively, integrate your thinking into the presentation. So, while both of the speakers have prepared their notes and slides, we'd love to weave in any questions that you have during the webinar. So if you do have any questions, if you could put them in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar software, and I'll see if we can figure out how to get those into the webinar. We have a lot of people joining today. I'm not sure how many questions we get, so we might not be able to get to all of them, but we'll also possibly have some time at the end for more questions. Again, use that question box in the GoToWebinar software. And I noted that the webinar has a lot of people today. I think one of the big reasons this topic has a lot of interest is just because of this big uncertainty in this time of and moment. None of us really know exactly what's going to emerge from the other side, and we're all collectively figuring out what's next. I think part of the great attendance might also be to the speakers that we have today, Sam Marshall from ClearBox Consulting and Stephen Fitzgerald from Habanero. So both of these gentlemen have been taking their deep thinking and their expertise into this world of, what is the future employee experience going to be like once we emerge from this global change. So by way of a quick introduction, and then I'll let them start speaking. I've been working with Stephen for over 20 years at Habanero. He started the company 25 years ago, and I've always known him as a really passionate and focused leader around the idea of helping people and organizations bring life to work through exceptional career experiences and helping improve workplaces and having them be better places for people to bring their full selves to. This work that Stephen sends also included landing our own company, Habanero in the top spot of the great places to work for 4 years. So thank you, Stephen, for creating such a great workplace. We're really excited to co-present with Sam Marshall, who's the owner of ClearBox Consulting. We know Sam in part, maybe most recently, because of our product's inclusion in his company's pioneering report, the SharePoint Intranets in a Box report. If you haven't read it or purchased it, it's an awesome report that gives a really non-biased view of the intranet space. But his reputation precedes that report. He's specialized in intranets in the digital workplace for over 20 years. We've been following a lot of his work for that long. Working with companies such as GSK and Vodafone, TUI Travel, Sony, and Unilever, so some really great big names. His current activities are focusing on intranets and the digital workplace strategy and the business side of Office 365. Sam is a regular keynote speaker at international conferences, and he's been named the contributor of the year for his CMS Wire column 6 years in a row. I just recently read his post, The Myth of the Digital Workplace Hub. It's a great post if you wanted to check it out on CMS Wire. And in 2015, Sam was given the Intranet Now Award for remarkable contribution to the Internet community. So Sam, thank you for all your contributions. We're happy to be able to co-present with you today. I'm going to turn it over to the both of you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so it's a real pleasure to join Habanero for this. We're just going to briefly introduce our companies. So my company, ClearBox, next week will be 14 years old, and mostly we focus on digital workplace strategy consulting. So usually when clients come to us, they're saying, look, we've got an intranet or we've got these different digital channels, and we see so many different ways in which we could take it. ClearBox, can you help us get some clarity around it, put together a roadmap and give us some direction? But as Brian mentioned, we also do a range of reports. We now cover 100 products in the intranet and employee app space, and we produce those across a number of reports. Some are on SharePoint, some are what we call independent intranets, and some of them are mobile first. And I'm sure Brian will show a link if you're interested in buying one of those, but we don't sell anything ourselves, so we are entirely vendor neutral and on the side of the buyer. So I'll hand over to Stephen to tell you a little bit more about Habanero.
Yeah, so Habanero exists to, I think, nudge the world of work forward in a very specific way. We really believe passionately that workplaces should be environments where people build amazing and fulfilling careers and use those careers to fuel better lives. And so specifically, Habanero's way of getting after that is through the employee experience. So we're very much an employee experience company. And I think a lot of people on this call would know us for Go, our intranet and product box that Brian mentioned, shows up in the ClearBox report. So it's a very integral part of how we solve employee experience problems. But I find it most orienting to think about where we show up in the problem domain. We do most of our work in this area where technology and workplace culture meet each other, and we bring human-centered design approaches to solving kind of the tougher employee experience problems.
And Stephen, I think what ClearBox and Habanero have in common is this focus on the people side of tech. And I saw you've done a really interesting study about the impact of COVID on how people were working. And I think just to frame our conversation today, it would be great if you could take us through some of what you found in that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world right now as organizations are thinking about how they pull out of the current state that we're all in. And Sam, we were talking before the call, we're finding some organizations are really aggressive, leaning into the opportunity, looking at this as an opportunity for them to capture market share, while others are really focused on just trying to get in a stable, sustainable mode right now. But in either case, across the spectrum, everyone's really focused on what trajectory do we need to hit to pull out. And so that was this context that we were starting to feel early on as soon as lockdown hit. And what we noticed was organizations almost immediately sent people home and lost track of what was going on with people. And the tools that they used to understand the employee experience and understand how people were doing were not really working. So most organizations doubled down and they took their annual survey and they did biweekly pulse surveys and things like that. So they were starting to get a lot of data, but not a lot of insight in terms of what was really happening with people at a human level. And so we took on what really felt like quite an ambitious study at the time. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to get to the heart of what was really going on with people. And so we have quite a deep and long history with empathetic research, and it's a way to actually get into past the kind of demographic information and get into really understanding people at a human level. So we took on a broader study to really find out like what's going on with people in this moment right now, and how is it affecting their ability to show up for themselves and for each other. And so we designed the study to focus on pulling those results out and trying to surface the bigger conclusions and understand how the world of work is really going to be impacted by the COVID lockdown. So the study, in terms of the breadth and depth, it's really focused on depth, but we managed to get to people in 49 countries. We managed to talk to almost a 85,000 person employee base across all the organizations we dealt with, but really the heart of the work was diving into listening labs and empathetic research workshops and interviews to really get to those rich stories.
Just explain listening labs. I'm just curious about that phrase, Stephen.
Yeah, so listening labs are our way to we actually pair up two researchers with one participant, and it's almost like a grounded theory way to go through and discover what's going on for a person. So imagine, Sam, you're participating in the survey, and me and another researcher would be talking to you, one observing and one trying to guide a conversation. What we're trying to do is to get you to set up to express what's really going on for you, because people really struggle to explain and characterize what their experiences were. Sure. So it took some expert facilitation for them to surface the highs and the lows of their experiences, and the listening labs is a really detailed, nuanced way of getting at that.
Great.
So this is a busy, complicated slide, and I didn't intend for people to study it with great detail. It's just one of the findings that come from the research. And this particular one, the punchline of it is that pre-COVID, almost 80% of the people, if you surveyed them, said that they would never or almost never work from home. But now that's down to around 12%. And so the point of this is that people's attitudes and beliefs around working from home and being in a hybrid mode have really changed. And this is but one, I would say, of a myriad of insights and changes that have happened in the world since COVID hit. And for us, one of the things we draw, the kind of meta conclusions from our study, is the world that we remember pre-COVID, the world of work, that really doesn't exist anymore. And perceptions about hybrid are only one dimension, but there's a lot of reasons why we can't go back to that world we were in before. And the state we're in right now, most organizations, people are still rattled. They're still on the edge. They're at the end of their tether in many ways. We're not in a sustainable mode. So we can't stay here and we can't go back. So really, this is an era where a period where organizations need to really think about designing for the future and what getting clear about the state they want to evolve into.
And if I can just kind of jump in and add to that with some of the things that we've seen, Stephen. So one headline that really struck me is 5.5 million years is the amount of time we spent just on Zoom in 2020. That's over 3 trillion minutes. And probably when you added Microsoft Teams, you can double that. Certainly, it felt like that to me in terms of the time I was spending looking at a screen during 2020. So we've seen this enormous shift in how we're working. And the way I think it's going to play out is that this hybrid workplace is going to be an enduring change. And that complicated graph, as Stephen called it, I thought it was a really good graph about that shift, I think, is going to be a big input. So let me talk you through this. If you look at hybrid workplace on the left, one of the impacts that's going to have that we're already seeing is people are saying, well, do I need to do that commute anymore? In London, for example, rental prices for the first time in 20 years are going down in the city centre, but going up in the surrounding villages and countryside. And people are liking it. And to move house, you know, is quite a permanent signifier. But people also do want that the social, the contacts that they enjoy with people in the workplace. So I can imagine there will be co-working spaces set up in all the towns and villages that people have moved to. What does that mean for an employer? Well, some of what used to feel like your employer brand and the connection that people felt with you was the fact that they went to a building, like an edifice that was decorated in your way, where they were surrounded by people working for the same company. If instead they're mixing with people who are working for other organizations in a space that you don't control, a lot of that influence goes away. A lot of that impression of the identity goes away. So as an employer, you're going to have to focus much more on the digital channel as your connection point. The employee experience becomes ever more important because basically that is the point of contact that employees go through. It's when they log on that they see you as the employer. And then if you work your way back to the bottom left, downsizing plus hybrid workplace. So unfortunately, with the economic stress that a lot of companies are feeling, they are reducing the size of the workforce. What we've seen as a trend over the last 10 years is that a lot of people, when they get redundant, set up as freelance. It's grown 50% in the last 10 years in the UK. In the US, the freelance industry is now bigger than the construction industry. You know, it's a massive entity in itself. And there was a Mercer survey that was done about 3 months ago. 70% of chief executives said that they expect the majority of the workforce will be freelance in 3 years' time. So what does it mean to be a company? It means you're going to have a lot more gig workers and far fewer staff. And what we should be thinking about to service that is a permeable digital workplace. What I mean by that is that often, you know, as a consultant, I get logins for working for a client company. And you're either entirely outside the company and you can't get anything unless someone emails you an attachment, or you're wholly inside a company. So recently I was invited to a treasure hunt and to sign the leaving card for a bloke I'd never heard of, because suddenly I was treated like I was an internal member of a department, which is kind of nice, but actually we need something more nuanced, which is to say, how do we take on board gig workers quickly so they can do a job for us without it taking 10 days from the hiring manager to actually get them up and running? Give them enough about our company to understand what our strategy is and what matters to them, maybe what our processes are, but also not to expose everything to them so that things like information security becomes a barrier in itself to getting them on board. And where does that drive to? Again, it drives into the importance of employee experience as a focal point. Stephen.
That's awesome. I love the kind of making sense of the macro perspective you're bringing to that. So we feel there's 3 really big areas of change that organizations need to get their hands around to be successful in the future. Given all that macro context, organizations need to really think carefully about their culture, about collaboration, which has changed dramatically, and about leadership. And there's some fascinating changes in leadership in the last short while that I'm sure are almost unprecedented. But just to step back a little bit, given the audience that the conversation we're having here with the people on the call today, I really feel this is an absolutely clutch time for all of us to think about how we show up as leaders in our organization. Someone needs to advocate for the employee experience, for the experience that the people in your organizations are having. And that conversation needs to find its way into the strategic conversations in your organization. So what I really hope to do, and what Sam and I really discussed in terms of the strategy of this conversation, is how do we give people some of the tools to show up in a more strategic way in their organization. So let's jump in, and we tried very hard to pull out the gems in the research. There's so much more that we could be talking about, but we're going to start with culture. And I really think of culture as the operating system of your organization. And given that we're going to be evolving and shaping our organizations, and running new applications, if you will, on that operating system, we need to think carefully about what will work in our operating system and what shifts and changes we might need to make to our operating system, or I'd say culture, in the future. So I think it's a really critical topic. And one of the key themes that came out of our research was this idea that the organizations that chose and were deliberately more open and transparent, sharing more within the organization, and sometimes sharing more outside the organization, they were disproportionately rewarded with more trust and higher employee engagement. So this idea of organizations being in this really difficult spot going through the COVID lockdown and responding by being open and opening their cultures up a little more, they really benefited from that. And so the thing to think about, though, is as we shift into more stable modes of working, how do we keep our organizations from backsliding into going back into the more closed way they were before? And how do we maintain that open culture? Another fascinating concept that we measured in our research is just the breaking down of some of the change friction that existed in organizations before COVID. And if you think about your organization you're in and the things that kept you the way you were, kept the organization the way we were, that change resistance that was built up in the organization, a lot of those factors have been broken down by the COVID, by the context and situation that we put our organizations in through COVID. And so we're actually in quite a change ready mode right now in organizations. It's a kind of fascinating thing to think about. And looking at that from a cultural point of view, we think of culture as being like an iceberg, and the big, heavy, meaty part of the iceberg that really controls where it goes and whether it floats or not is below the water. And in the culture, that's the shared belief system that people have in that organization, and it's largely transparent in the organization. It's hard to decipher, but it's really where the behaviors and all the workings of the culture come from. And so the thing to recognize about beliefs is that they do change very slowly, and that's why cultures work well for us. We can show up at our organization day after day and expect to be treated in specific ways. We don't have to put a lot of mental energy into reassessing and refiguring out a culture every day, and that consistency is really important for us as humans. But we're in a time right now with COVID where our organizations have shifted so much, and so much of it has been unintentional. So our cultures are a little bit more fluid than they have been in the past, and it's really important for us to think about how we design that culture for the future.
And Stephen, I'm going to kind of
slide over to you. Yeah.
Jump in with a bit of a counterpoint, because culture as an operating system is a really nice way of putting it, but pragmatically, maybe because I'm a bit closer to retirement than you, I'm kind of don't feel like a lot of what I do has time to wait for the culture to change. So I often say, let's think of it as a constraint, or at least think of it as the grain that you got to work with if you want to see results, rather than trying to change culture to get an outcome. And here's a piece of work I did, which is based on a culture framework called competing values. And the message is, if you want to get people collaborating, understanding what is going with the grain in your organization's collaboration culture will make your life a whole lot easier. And sometimes, people will come to me saying, I was talking to a guy from another company and they use Yammer, and Yammer was amazing for them. It solved all kinds of problems. We tried it and we couldn't even get people showing pictures of their pets. Well, what's going on? And the answer is, well, you heard a success story from somewhere else with a very different culture. So in this competing values framework, you've got one dimension, sharing and control, which is about the extent to which the culture is open. And you've got one which is integration versus differentiation, which is whether the culture looks for things that they have in common, or differentiation, things that set them apart. So top left, high sharing, high integration, it's all about people. So imagine you're new to the organization and you say, I want to tackle this problem. When it's people relationships, the answer you get is, I don't think anyone's really documented that, but Joe knows everything on this. Come on, let's go and get a coffee with Joe and he'll tell us. Whereas integration high control is much more about a hierarchy. It tends to be more technical, and some would say, oh, the answer to that is that there's a process document 72B, make sure you get version 3.2.1 because we all want people to do it the same way. High control but differentiation tends to look outside and says, what's it that sets us apart from, say, the competition? So probably the message you'll get is, well, make sure that you tell our customers the same thing so that we're all aligned in terms of our external USPs. High sharing and differentiation is about innovation. So it's open to new ideas, but it's also saying, well, we're not so interested in what's happened before. If you've got a problem, yeah, let's brainstorm some solutions and let us know how you get on because we might learn something new. What does that mean in terms of a hybrid organization? Well, if we think of hybrid crudely as being what do you do with face-to-face time versus what do you do digitally that can happen anytime, any place? In an innovation culture, the face time might be about brainstorming, but digitally it might also be about recreating some of that water cooler serendipity, which isn't happening by, for example, having experts blogging ideas and using social networks. For people relationships, when you do in the hybrid world get to meet people again, it will all be about regenerating relationships and forming ties. But also digitally, you might work out loud. You might say, hey, Stephen, next week I'm going to talk to this customer. And Stephen might jump in saying, oh, I know Joe there, have a word with Joe. He's a really good guy. And in the hierarchy dimension, the FaceTime might be actually about reinforcing the status of the authority. It might be about a lecture from the senior scientist. But actually, hierarchy cultures are really good about working in terms of documentation digitally, so they're going to be really comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. The market one of the things we're hearing is celebrating success is becoming a little bit of a victim of people working more in silos and maybe within individual teams. So using FaceTime to share and celebrate success and some of the emotive content can become really important there. So lots to say about cultures. Stephen, do you want to?
Yes. Yeah. There's definitely such a deep, rich topic. One last thing I wanted to share, and I think this is a really critical thing for people, is just to think about whether we're trying to adapt our culture or trying to adapt to our culture. I think both those perspectives are really valid, and I appreciate Sam's perspective on how to not work against the grain. What I find though is that organizations by and large don't really understand very much about their culture in general, and they understand a lot less about it now. And so one of the things that I talked about early on in our study is that organizations went out and they did a lot of surveys, and we've been experiencing this conversation about being sort of data rich and insight poor. So I wanted to share a quick, simple model that I think can be really helpful for people. If you think about employee insight, we want to learn what's going on. We want to make decisions based on great evidence. So we need to go and understand what's going on. So that's a form of research. And research tools, they span from quantitative research tools that you can get a lot of breadth quickly from, or deeper, richer, more nuanced qualitative tools. Research tools also span from ones that are based on starting with an idea of how something works. We have a hypothesis or a mental model, and we can test that by asking people about what they think about it. One in the spectrum all the way up to research approaches that are more based on adding some expertise into a mode of observation to draw conclusions. And so what we really advocate is organizations thinking about a mixed methods research approach to build some kind of employee experience center of excellence where they're really understanding what's going on. Most organizations we talk to, they have really strong employee survey functions. That's not going away. It's an important part of it. But it really is focused on asking, we can only get out information that's as good as the questions we know to ask. And unfortunately, right now during COVID, things are so different. We're less able to know the questions to ask than we are in general. So filling out this balanced portfolio of approaches to create a mixed method approach, just want to highlight a few things. Diagonally across from employee experience, I have empathetic interviews, and that's an example of a broader range of research techniques, empathetic research techniques that are really quite observational and qualitative and nuanced, and they really add a lot of color and complement to the breadth of a survey. As well, there's some amazing things happening with tools like Microsoft Workplace Analytics in terms of being able to really observe what's going on in the organization, draw meaningful conclusions about what's happening with people's interactions and even their cultures, and in some cases even mental health. So there's a really fascinating growing sector in there that's sort of observational based, but quantitative and data driven.
That one's a little bit controversial sometimes, isn't it, Stephen? The analytics one, and it's funny that everybody I think would be absolutely fine with the empathetic interviews, but when it's a machine that's watching you, there's less comfort. Do you see many organizations that have really rolled it out yet, or are they still piloting it?
It's early, and you're bang on. The conversation about being clear with your people about the intent of measuring these things is absolutely critical, because it can come across as being, big brother watching you, and what are we going to do with that information? So I think it can really go sideways without setting it in the right culture and the right context and really educating people about how it's being used.
Yeah. But I love this diagram. As a consultant, I love every 2x2 matrix, but I particularly think that's something that most people would understand and would definitely relate to it.
We definitely love the 2x2 grid world. That one of the big conclusions, and we're trying to pull some bigger conclusions out, is that we really feel there's opportunities for organizations to lean into this idea of building better capabilities in terms of surfacing real evidence about the employee insight and employee experience rather. So that employee listening capability is something worth growing.
Yeah. So I started talking about collaboration, but that's the next section that you get. And maybe just to frame it, collaboration to some people can be like conversations or the kind of to and fro instant messaging that happens on things like Teams and Slack, all the way through to the scale where other organizations would talk about collaboration as being maybe a 3-year relationship that they have with a supplier. Where do you guys tend to talk about collaboration?
Yeah, we see the broad range. We see it in terms of how people connect and build relationships, and it's a component of belonging in the organization, all the way down to how teams work and people get their jobs done. So we really try and take the broad perspective, looking at it from those deeper human levels, all the way to the mechanics of productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So our research has been found some fascinating areas, and one thing I can say that's quite interesting is there's likely never been a time where we've seen more innovation in terms of collaboration. One of the components that came out of our research that's quite interesting is and quite alarming is just how isolated people are feeling. When people went home, their first reaction is, "Oh my goodness, I'm so much more productive." But the feeling of isolation is a creeping something that's been creeping and growing slowly. So we feel it's really important for organizations to really think about how they design communications and connection tools in the organization. And what we're finding is a lot of
there's a little bit of your panel that's showing over the slide. If you just want to move that other speaker window over, thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Perfect.
Got such lovely slides. I'd hate to see them.
I'm sending notes behind the scenes, and it's so disruptive to do that, but thank you.
That's funny. So we're finding organizations do a wonderful job of designing tools for senior leaders and those kind of core corporate communications. But what we've noticed is there's just been a decrease in commitment, investment in solving problems for the breadth of the organization. And so this is a key opportunity to try and mitigate some of the feelings of isolation that people are feeling. So that's a key element of finding. And I think one of the big conclusions to draw from that is to bring in the idea of that meaningful human connection into the design work around collaboration, how these systems work, rather than just thinking about it as a tool for doing our jobs better and being more productive. It will really benefit organizations if they can think about it at the human connection level as well.
Just say a bit more about what you meant on the last slide about solving problems. Are you saying commitment from the CEO, from the leadership team, solving problems?
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. What I'm talking about is the teams in the organization, the people on this call really, that where they put their time and energy to invest in building the tools and capabilities in the organization. So if we're building an intranet, for example, we'll generally put a lot of time into videos from the CEO, but we're not necessarily putting in enough time and energy to think about how we bring the culture to life and create cultural rich story and creating connection points for people at a person-to-person level.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Another thing that's quite interesting is we found that team affinity was really strong. It actually went up when the lockdown came, so people felt closer to their teammates. But the counterbalance to that is people felt they felt more isolated from other teams. So silos, we found silos are really growing significantly in the organization. This is one of the typical quotes we found in our research, is that people were conscious of the silos, but they were actually felt disempowered for actually getting around that. So we really feel there's this opportunity for organizations to think about cross-channel collaboration, try and wire in and facilitate different ways to get communications and conversations going across the board. So that's an important area that organizations need to be conscious of. And a third one is this idea that, and Sam, I think you talked about it really well right out of the gate, but I always think, if I completely simplify things, the employee experience design target of the past was, human in cubicle, roughly speaking. And every step you took out of that cubicle, your experience was slightly more degraded. I went to a boardroom and things didn't quite work very well. And I worked from home and things were kind of terrible. But we accept that because really the design target is person in cubicle. I think what has to happen in the future and what's really critical is for organizations to create and be explicit about creating a new employee experience design target. So to say that we are our primary design target for the employee experience is it's location independent, it's digital, it's more fluid, whatever it makes sense most for your organization, your context. But I think that's a big shift organizations have to go through.
I quite agree. And I used to have a couple of slides, and the first one was like a funky head office, where they got the pool table and they got these brightly colored sofas, and it's like, oh, come in, you genius people, sit down and do your marvelous work. And then you'd log into the digital experience, and it was almost like an Atari. It was so outdated, and it was back to the factory and back to the kind of Victorian sending children up chimneys in terms of how the organization expressed whether it valued the employee or not. It was a funny disconnect. And now, yeah, it's definitely the focus is much more on the latter. And we're hearing lots of organizations saying we need to express our brand digitally, which is great.
Yeah. So Sam, I know you had some really practical ideas to share that I think really support this idea.
So, I mean, just to pick one theme, which is about workshops and meetings, because they're a bane in most people's lives. And ClearBox, we've actually been running remote workshops for 5 years or so, because often you can't afford to fly someone in from Canada, but you'd really like their input into a workshop that's happening in Europe. So I wrote a blog post, how virtual workshops can be best in reality, with a few tips that I'll share with you here. So the first one is that you get a real kind of bandwidth issue when you're working in a Zoom or Teams environment, because you're basically waiting for one person to stop speaking. And it's really hard to have the kind of side conversations that you'd have if you're in a room where just speaking loudly or softly basically moderates the bandwidth. So one thing to do is say, well, actually, there's a real plus to digital, which is that people can work in parallel a lot more easily. So for example, if one guy stood up at the front and presenting in a meeting room, you'd get people writing on Post-it notes. In a Zoom meeting, we use things like a Trello board, which everybody has access to say, when you hear something, capture it on a Trello note. And the other good thing about using Trello is I think people are forgetting how to handwrite. You give someone a Sharpie and they're like, oh my God, this isn't a keyboard. I once spent like an hour trying to decipher a Post-it note where the idea was give employees badges. I was like, why do employees want badges? And actually they were saying badges, like merit awards or kudos, but the handwriting was so terrible, couldn't make sense of it. And also in the same vein, encourage side conversations in chat. So, in a real meeting, someone might say something, I go, Stephen, I don't really understand that, did you? And Stephen would go, no, it wasn't very clear. And Stephen's affirmation says, now I feel confident to stick my hand up and say, can you say that again? Because it wasn't very clear. We can do that in a lot of meetings by having a side chat channel open and legitimizing it. So the facilitator saying, use this chat, you don't have to, again, wait to speak. The third thought is, sometimes when you're in a meeting or a workshop and it's getting a little bit tense and you feel like you've hit an impasse, so let's break and have a coffee. And how many times have people wandered into the corridor and had a little conversation in smaller groups, and they come back in and say, yeah, we just got an idea, and suddenly that blocker has gone.
Yeah.
So digitally, we need to make sure that when you say have a break, people don't immediately dive onto the email inbox, but actually they can go into breakout rooms, digital channels, side channels, and carry on those conversations. And I would say it's really important, therefore, to remind people that audio and video quality digitally is very, very important. And even if, as we move into a hybrid world where they might be able to sit next to someone else, don't do that, because everyone else gets really bad audio and you see like half a face because the camera's trying to figure out what it's focused on. And then the last two are really about, I think the tradition of work in the physical workplace has always been, we need to block book meeting rooms. So therefore it's a half-hour or 1 hour slot because there's this asset that can't be occupied in parallel. We don't need to do that anymore. Because people are not traveling for a face-to-face meeting, you don't have to get through everything in an 8-hour block. Sometimes we'll say, well, we'll do three-hour blocks over multiple days so that people don't get tired. But also at the end of day one, I say to people, tonight you'll probably start dreaming about intranets. When you do, put it on that Trello note, and then tomorrow we'll come back and review all the extra thoughts you had in the downtime. And the last one, provocatively, why not have meetings at 23 minutes if 23 minutes is what it takes? And now I'm a big fan of the 45-minute meeting booking. So we've got a bit of slack time in between meetings. Yeah. And if it still only takes 23 minutes, great. We don't have to sit there and fill that block of time.
Yeah, it's just a nice way to be kind, isn't it?
Yes,
what's fascinating about this is all these are behaviors or habits that organizations have to develop over time. You can't policy your way into being good at this. It's about actually shifting your culture and the behavior so people really appreciate, oh, I'm being kind to my coworkers when I create a 23-minute meeting. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a leadership behavior, I think, that would be propagated down very readily.
Yeah. So that those are the collaboration challenges we talked about. And the last bucket I wanted to get into is leadership. And I can say right now, I feel it's fascinating that what constitutes great leadership now, I think is quite dramatically different than it was pre-COVID. And there's been such an impressive and interesting change. And so I wanted to dig into a few key areas of that change. One of them is just the mechanics of work from home sent people out of the gaze of their managers and their supervisors and their leaders home. And because of that and other circumstances of COVID, people were granted a lot more freedom, a lot more autonomy in the work that they did. And actually, this is my favorite quote from the whole study. Actually, no, this isn't. I got another one coming up that's even better. But this quote shows just the what people were experiencing, that all along I knew that if I could work more independently, I could be more productive. And finally, we've been forced in this situation. The leaders are now finally trusting me. So think about what's going on inside a human being when they feel trusted that way. What we've measured is that they developed a higher sense of trust for their leaders in the organization. And we also measured that the organization's trust for those people increased. But what was really cool about this is we measured people, their sense of the value and the worth of the work that they were doing went up. And think about what happens when that happens. When people really start to feel that they're doing something that's meaningful, they put different energy, different creativity, and different effort into that work. So that's quite dramatic. The thing is, how do we shift to a world where once we get into the new normal, leaders are able to still manage with this autonomy? How do we stop from backsliding into micromanagement as we go forward? So that's a very important thing for organizations to think very carefully about. We also measured quite a bit of impact in terms of leaders showing up in a really authentic way. Sorry, this was my favorite quote that I wanted to share. I just love for her leader to be struggling a bit, to show up on video, sitting in the woods with 3 days beard growth and a hatchet and a bottle of Everclear. And what this person is saying is that I want to be able to connect to my leader like a human being, and I want them to see me as one. And I want them to realize that my world is different than yours, and we're all going through difficult things, but we're doing this together. And so this idea of leaders showing up and being more open, showing more vulnerability, being able to not be vague, but being able to express that we don't know how this is going to go. This is our best bet, and we're trying this and this, and actually experiment with ideas and share when they fail and share the learnings from it, and be accessible and be candid. These ideas are they're cultural shifts that aren't just about leadership. They actually signal a broader shift in the organization adopting more agile behaviors. And this is a really fascinating outcome. Organizations of all stripes, even the really big, old, very structured ones, have had to adapt and be more agile to get through the last year. And so we see this as a really exciting opportunities for organizations to start to get clear about these new agile behaviors and say, okay, well, what did that do for us? And how can we protect some of those? And how can we enshrine those agile behaviors and become more of an agile organization over time? So we see this as just a massive opportunity.
What I like in that list you just showed about the communication styles is that for a long time we've been saying, look, leaders don't have all the answers. We know they don't have all the answers. And a pandemic, everybody realizes that no one's got all the answers. So it's a great time to shift gear and try a different style, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great time to stop the charade, to stop pretending that as a leader, I can map out the next 2 years and every step along the way, and you just need to follow me. That's not what leadership is. Leadership is enabling other people to be successful. So this is a transition time to lean into that. Yeah. So finally, the last leadership component I wanted to talk about is this idea of just how different the experiences people are having. So pre-COVID, everyone's a human. We all experience things differently. And we've always been fighting against this this idea that started in the Industrial Revolution and really picked up in the 50s, where organizations were all about pounding people into behaving in predictable ways. And so we would, the design impetus in the 50s was we would give up human ingenuity and creativity by if we got more consistency and process thoroughness in the organization. But what happened in COVID is there's been this explosion of people integrating their personal lives into their work. We're dealing with all sorts of circumstances. The world is going through some crazy things. And so the breadth of experiences we're all going through is much wider and much more diverse now than it was before. And so the quote, one of the quotes that came up on our research, which I think is just wonderful, is when a leader was saying, we're all in this boat together. And the person was saying, no, we're not in the same boat. You're not experiencing the same things I am, not even close. And they came up with this idea that we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats in that storm. And I think that's a really powerful idea. And there's this opportunity for leadership to show up, yes, in a more humanistic way, but in a humanistic way that really honors the diversity and the differences and the uniqueness of what's going on in the organization. Because we know, and there's lots of research to back this up, if we honor people's individuality and uniqueness, we get a stronger organization as a result.
And I wanted to complement that point with a bit of research that I came across. It was in the Journal of Management Psychology, but it was summarized really nicely by a lady called Folletto, if you look at the credit in the bottom right. What they did in this experiment was they had 700 participants, and they manipulated the degree of digital leadership versus face-to-face. At one end of the spectrum, everybody was face-to-face. At the other end, purely digital, and in the middle, hybrid. And the quote I picked out in the pink text is in the virtual world, we are less swayed by someone's personality and can more accurately assess whether or not they're actually engaging in important leadership behaviors. Basically, what the research was looking at was who actually emerges as a leader in these different circumstances. And you can see the two columns, the kind of leadership qualities in person versus remote. But what struck me is I'm reading all these articles, over the last 8 months, and some leaders saying, we need to get everybody back into the office, all this working from home, it's a temporary thing. I can't wait to get everybody back to work like work hadn't been happening. And I'm thinking maybe they're saying this because they've risen to the top by being very strong at the personality side have been extroverted and charismatic, engaging in person. And they're struggling in this virtual world because the weight of what's important to the employees has shifted towards someone who is more about connecting, facilitating, keeping the wheels turning in a way that's checking in with everybody and being less about being the dominant person in the room. So some leaders, I think, are going to have to shift their leadership style. But also, if we move to a permanent hybrid way of working, organizations may have to revisit their succession plans and say, is a different style of leadership going to be more appropriate to this division or this team that we're going to put that person in place with?
I think that's such a wonderful spot to end up in this conversation, because I think a lot of what we talked about is asking people, and particularly leaders, to show up in a different way. And it's true, like one dimension of leadership is persuasion, and people's ability to be persuasive is completely, it's shifted quite a bit in this new world. And that's putting people in a vulnerable spot, and organizations need to, the inappropriate reaction is say, well, let's get back to the way we were so I can regain my moral authority in the organization. I think leaders really have to show some courage and step into a new way of behaving, and organizations need to rethink what great leadership is. So I love that perspective. So just to summarize, we had these 5 key takeaways. One was about really getting clear about using great evidence as a design input into designing the future. The second one was around trying to do a much better job of creating opportunities for human connection in the organization. And then we talked about reorienting the employee experience target to be something that's more digital and location independent. And then there was the whole topic around organizations becoming more agile, and how do we acknowledge that and build on it, because it's a very important and powerful characteristic we can adopt as organizations. And the fifth large theme was all around how leaders show up, creating humanistic workplaces, and honoring that diversity, and how special and different it is for everyone in the organization. And Sam, I'm expecting we have some questions. I just want to throw one last note out to the participants. I really feel like this is the time for all of us as individuals to lean into this idea that we have to show up as leaders in our organization and find ways to really help our organizations see the world in a different way, and really advocate for the employee experience.
And just in case people think we've been too down on leaders, I might add, I've seen some fantastic responses by some of the leaders that we work with. They've really been out there. They've kind of not worried about having the camera on and showing all the clutter they got in the junk room where they're having the meeting from, and they've really been very open to dealing with questions and actually responsive to the mental well-being of their employees and the work well-being as well.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks both of you. We do have some questions. They're kind of meta questions, so I felt they were kind of appropriate at the end. But I also want to leave room for people to continue asking questions. Just on this theme of leadership, which sounds like this fits that immediate last conversation we had, can you share any tips on what a people leader can or should do to raise the conversation about leadership style within the organization? So what I get from this question is, I'm one person in a vast sea of leaders. What do I do to impact our idea of what leadership should look like in the future?
I have a very quick answer, and I'll hand it off to you, Sam. What we find is nothing creates a persuasive argument in an organization quite like bringing real evidence for how leadership styles impact people. So rather than critiquing the leadership style, bring in evidence of how it impacts people who are being affected by it. And so coming with even those, we were showing quotes from our research, showing up with senior leaders and saying, this is actually how this kind of leadership is landing on people, and this is how this kind of leadership is landing on people. It's your choice. What do you think is the best way to go? That can be really persuasive, because it takes out the kind of moralistic what's right or wrong, what's the best way to leadership. It takes out the debate about all that things, and it just focuses on the outcomes that should be clear that the organization is trying to create.
That's great.
I guess that as ever, I'll be a bit contrarian and say that I'd be really surprised if your people could tell you about what kind of leadership style they want. I'm not sure I could have ever told my boss, this is how I want you to manage me, beyond kind of, oh, I didn't like that, and kind of the grumbling sort of thing. So I would say it's a lot more about just monitoring and almost like trying different things out and seeing what response it gets. And some of that might be the direct qualitative. I had a great, can't remember where I saw it, but someone saying their manager basically kept saying to them, you know, how are you doing? And people would say, yeah, I'm fine. And the manager says, no, you're not. None of us are fine. You know, this is a dreadful
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
Let me tell you then, I'm feeling terrible. You know, it's been really stressful and I'm not sleeping as much. So how are you doing? And you'll know if that evokes the right response or not. And then the other one
Yeah.
is it just, you know, getting away from like the annual employee climate survey and doing more just kind of pulse checks and asking, you know, what's on your mind? How are you feeling about motivation for work? How are you feeling about understanding what's happening? And doing it really regularly, but sampling different parts of the organization, because over the course of the pandemic, the way people have changed in terms of their stress or expectations, that's a real moving target as well. You can't ask them once and then say, okay, well, we've got a 6-month communication plan that we're going to drip feed in and assume that it's a fixed target.
That's great. I love your point about leaders being just honest about where they're at. In conversations I've had with customers, one customer in particular said their leader showed up long into the pandemic in a big global sort of town hall and said, I'm exhausted, I'm tired, I don't know what to do next.
Yeah.
And their feedback from the organization about that moment was it was the most emotionally secure people felt with their organization, which is, you know, such an ironic twist, right? Of just expressing that honesty, creating that that sense of connection.
And that's the kind of evidence I'm talking about. So that in that particular situation, that's completely changed how that organization thinks about leadership, because they got this direct feedback from people that when a leader showed up, in this case the CEO, and was raw and authentic, it really impacted how I felt about the organization. They didn't have to be articulate about it and put it in a leadership model. They just had to say, that really made me feel secure, and it really changed my perspective on the day. That's the kind of evidence that really moves organizations.
That's great. I have a question from Michael here. In organizations that aren't fully embracing employee experience, what have you seen as the tipping point to shift mindsets in this space? Which I think is a really interesting question. You know, I think a lot of organizations kind of leaned into, we need to just get stuff done, and like, you know, be damned how we get it done. And so what is that tipping point? What are the indicators?
I'll go first on that one. The clients we work with that have really made big strides have seen employee experience as an outcome in itself and not a means to something else that's important to them. And I know that's easy to say, but you know, most organizations that have like, these are our top 5 priorities. And you can try and sell into one of those priorities saying, well, if we've got engaged employees, they'll be more productive. And if they're more productive, then that will hit our performance goals. And it all kind of, that chain of reasoning breaks down at some point. But if they say, we want to be an employer of choice, we want to recruit the best talent and be a great place to work, and those kind of phrases. And then when we say to them, so you get that the digital experience is very much about what it means to be a great place to work. Now they say yes, then you can start working on it.
That's good. I do hear in my conversations with clients, there are still a few companies putting their heads in the sand about the change and shift in that working from far. But what a massive shift in the potential global, you know, pool of talent that we need to be able to respond to. So I like your ideas of raising the sort of business conversation around this, which is we want to be able to access great talent, and this requires us to change.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping 2 years ago when I kind of pitched digital workplace and people say, well, what's the return on investment? And you'd have to talk about reducing travel and so on. And when he said, well, there's also risk mitigation, you know, imagine if there's a big disaster and people can't come to work, and like, oh yeah, we're fine with that. We'll send everybody a text message and tell them to come to work tomorrow. And now hopefully no one's going to say to me, oh, Sam, we're not worried about the situation where nobody could come into work. That's never going to happen. So
That could never
even
happen.
if it's just about continuity of business, then it's up the agenda.
I do think that
Oh, sorry,
there's a big difference between organizations where leaders truly understand that the success of that organization is bound up in how successful they can make the employees in the organization. And unfortunately, we encounter organizations that don't see it that way. They see people as more interchangeable. Human carbon units was a phrase that gets thrown around, but I think if you're in that context, you're always going to be picking at the edges of the potential of employee experience. Because what I think embracing employee experience means for organizations is becoming more humanistic. And there's a lot of strategies to build followership around those ideas. For example, we really find it really helps, and I think this marries up with what you're saying, Sam. It really helps if someone owns the idea of employee experience and culture, and actually has some authority, moral authority in the organization to do something about it. Because if it's just a concept that's floating around, it'll be really hard to make consistent progress on it.
I agree with you, but also there's the impatient bit of me that wants to say, but there's a really practical thing that you can do underneath that. And it's just, when someone takes on a job, you recruit them and you hire them on day one, they're full of enthusiasm. They've chosen to make a big life change, come and work for you because they're with you. Mm-hmm. And what we do is we erode that motivation by making it hard to get the job done. I want to write this proposal, but I need to do a password reset. And oh gosh, my laptop's so slow. And all those bits that chip away at getting the job done actually brings motivation down. It's not employee experiences lifting people's motivation. It's actually saying, let's just get out the way and let them do what they are already keen on doing. And a good employee experience just lets people make progress on things that matter to them.
Yeah, and you don't have to sell anyone on this call on that. I think the heart of the question that's complicated is making it a priority for leaders who have a dim view of the potential of the humans in the organization. I think less and less of those leaders exist. And so I really think you're right. We have to do everything we can. But organizations that really make progress, they get it at a senior level. They understand that.
Yeah.
We for everyone that's listening in, we have 1 more minute. We're probably not going to get to every question, Mohammed. We're not going to be able to get your question. I'm going to throw a altitude down question, just maybe 10 words or less answer to close this up. I think that we can walk away with some practical tip. I think this is a really interesting question. How do you develop and encourage tacit knowledge in a digital workplace? This is a moment where it's hard to kind of capture people being at home and not having those water cooler conversations, and the implicit stuff is missing, so we need to rely a bit more on tacit. What are your thoughts on that? A quick 10 words or less, 20 words or less?
Tacit knowledge, leave it in people's heads. Don't try and capture it, but just make connections with the experts and people who need to know the answer.
Encourage connections, great.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. My whole thing was about collisions, and I could just very much related. Like, how do you engineer more randomness to create more collisions where ideas can connect and grow and blossom? And that it's less about making tacit knowledge explicit, more about actually creating more of almost like a neural fiber in your organization by connecting brains.
Great. Thank you both for your awesome thoughts and the presentation today. Your contact information is obviously on the screen for everyone, and I encourage people, if you have questions or follow-up, to just contact people directly in their organizations. And we like I said, we have been recording this, and we'll make sure everyone that's listening gets a link today. And yeah, have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. We're multiple time zones here right now in this webinar, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye.